book I read this year that I really loved was Don't Fear the Reaper by Stephen Graham Jones. This is the sequel to actually one of my favorite books of I think a year or two ago called My Heart is a Chainsaw, which followed Jade Daniels, a native girl in a small town in Idaho that's beset by weird phenomena and killings, and she uses her encyclopedic knowledge of horror movies, specifically slasher movies, to solve the crimes and kind of survive. Here we find her, she is one of the few survivors from the massacre that happened at the end of that, so she's still trying to get her life together when bodies start piling up yet again. During a ferocious storm on the outskirts of Proof Rock, her town, a legendary serial killer escapes, and she has to once again put this her trauma and knowledge of slasher movies to the test to try to save the townsfolk and herself. What Stephen Graham Jones does with this is kind of amazing in that he takes the slasher genre, like lowest of the low in the horror genre, real sometimes schlocky and exploitative, and really elevates it with amazing characters, wonderful prose, a really developed world. With all the elevation, I don't want to make it sound like it's too literary or boring, and I'm going to steal this from another review because they worded it up perfectly. This is from the Cemetery Dance magazine review. He gets into all the blood and guts without disrespecting its vital, primitive idiocy that we all unabashedly are attracted to.
One of the books I really enjoyed reading this year is Mr. Magic by Kirsten White. It's a very interesting story about a variety of children who grew up on the set of a TV show. But unfortunately, when they're called back for a reunion about 20 years later, it seems that nobody remembers the content of the episodes, how it ended, where they lived, who they worked with, and what it was like being on a set. This story introduces questions pretty much immediately out of the gate, and each time you get an answer to one of those questions, it actually ends up giving you 2 or 3 more questions about what's really going on. The characters were a lot of fun to work with. We see both what they were like as little children and what they are like now 20 years later as adults, how their experience on Mr. Magic changed who they are, who they grew up to be, and also how Mr. Magic really affected them long-term, both psychologically and in the choices that they made going forward. It deals with a lot of childhood and carrying through to adulthood trauma, and it also deals with the difficulties of wanting to do better for the people who come after you and not knowing how. So there's a lot to dig up here in Mr. Magic. There's fun, there's mystery, it's definitely pretty funny, and there's a lot to explore out in the Utah desert.
I read Yellowface by R.F. Kuang, and it is a darkly humorous thriller. It's part horror story and part satire of the publishing industry, calling out its issues with racism, diversity, and cultural appropriation. And it tells the story of Juniper Song, who witnesses the death of her friend Athena and then steals her manuscript and publishes it under her own name. But Juniper is not Asian American, and it was not her story to tell, and the novel tells about what she'll do to try and keep this secret as her story falls apart.
Is titled Empress of the Nile by Lynn Olson. And the person that the biography is about is Christiane de Roche Noblecoux. And she is known as the Empress of the Nile because she was an Egyptologist who saved Egypt's ancient temples from destruction. When the country of Egypt was building the Aswan Dam back in the 1950s, she, as a very well-known Egyptologist, stepped in and was able to save many of the monuments that would be flooded by the waters of the Aswan Dam. The real interesting part to me is they talk about in the book how she was instrumental in helping to save those monuments, but in her early life, already when she was a toddler, her grandfather took her to the Louvre, and she was able to see all of the Egyptian artifacts that they have in the Louvre, and became interested even at a very young age. The book develops over the time of her life, and during the Nazi regime, she helps to rescue paintings and artifacts and other artworks from the Louvre Museum, and they move them around in the countries of Europe, trying to keep them away from the Nazis who are plundering the artworks of Europe. That part to me was really very interesting to see the detail of how that was done. The British Museum and the Louvre were in competition in those times, and maybe they still are, but they were in competition for a lot of the artifacts that were found in Egypt. And she was one of the people who saw to it that the Louvre was able to get many of these artifacts. And she did lead the campaign to save the ancient Nubian monuments from flooding.
Do you want to dive into a deep, intense, exciting fantasy adventure book? Check out Martha Wells' newest, Witch King. You might have heard Martha Wells' name with the hugely popular sci-fi series Murderbot. This is returning back to Martha Wells' roots with a fantasy book. It's a standalone as of now, but there's an open for a possible sequel. In this book, Witch King, we first meet the demon Kai, and Kai is woken up in a tomb. Kai's demonhood means that his soul is not tethered to any body, and he can jump from body to body depending on who he wants to be at that time. He also gains power from draining life from other creatures. Kai has to go find his friend Ziti, who is a witch, who's in a similar predicament, and then Ziti and Kai go on an adventure to find Taryn, who is Ziti's wife. They're trying to unravel what has happened to them before they have woken up in the tomb, and they're also living in a world that is trying to reconstruct itself post a horrible war. The story is also taking place on a second timeline where the reader gets to meet Kai's early childhood and then his lead up to his involvement in the resistance movement against this war that is happening. The dual timeline is probably one of the more challenging pieces of the book, but it's also the most rewarding, and this is where Martha Wells really succeeds in. You get to see Kai as a child, Kai as a teenager, learning his powers, learning how to be a demon, and then you get the jaded Kai of the present. And you have those comparisons of characters, and it really makes it a more well-rounded, more invested story. In this adventure, you also have great, wonderful things that Martha Wells is doing with creative things with the plot, with the world building, with each of the individual character backgrounds. Not only are you invested in Kai's story, but you get invested in the rest of the ragtag team story as well, their backgrounds. You meet, again, the witch Ziti, another witch who is mute, an escaped slave, a scholar, a character who is sort of an angel, but also the black sheep of the family. All of these characters you feel invested in and you want to know more about. It is a challenging read. Martha Wells does not hold your hand leading into that world, but it is definitely worth it. And it's really diverse. You have characters who are queer, who are trans. You have a world built that is decidedly not white. It is doing so many great things on so many wonderful levels, and if you put the time and effort to really learn what is happening, if you give it that first third, the rest of it will just fly by. Really enjoy it.
I picked 3 mystery books to talk to you about. The first one is called World of Curiosities by Louise Penny. Louise Penny is a Canadian author who's written a series of books set in the fictional village of Three Pines, Quebec. They introduce you to a series of characters headed by Chief Inspector Gamache. This book is very detailed. It's a good standalone book, but if you've read the rest of the series, it does help explain who some of the characters are.
This year I read And There Was Light by John Meacham, his new biography of Abraham Lincoln. I really enjoyed this book as a look at the moral evolution of Abraham Lincoln. It serves as both a great introduction to the life of Abraham Lincoln, but it's especially good at telling the story of his moral evolution on the issues of slavery and equality. It also does a wonderful job of introducing us to a very human Abraham Lincoln, not just Abraham Lincoln as a monument, as a leader, but as a human who suffered terrible loss, the loss of his mother, the loss of 2 of his children. There are wonderful moments of joy, such as when he meets Grace Bettle, the little girl who wrote him a letter encouraging him to grow a beard during the campaign in 1860, as well as his first meeting with Frederick Douglass in the White House, a momentous occasion. It's a great book for anybody that's interested in that time period, as well as in Abraham Lincoln, and anyone especially who's interested in the moral struggles and how he balanced that with the political necessities of the day.
Done.
I think so.
Another book that I really enjoyed was MCU, The Reign of Marvel Studios, written by Joanna Robinson, Dave Gonzalez, and Gavin Edwards. What you have here is a highly in-depth account of the rise of Marvel Studios and the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which kind of got its proper start in 2008 with the release of the Iron Man movie, and showed how it went from this shaky industry built on basically Marvel's bankruptcy in the 1990s to this multi-billion-dollar film studio that now has multiple movies and the highest grossing movies of all time. This gives you a play-by-play essentially per movie how that happened. A lot of the goings-ons corporately behind the scenes, the big egos and the huge amounts of money, problems and kind of near misses. Even if you were following the movies when they were come out, I learned new stuff. Samuel L. Jackson had basically a clause in his contract that he said, do whatever you want for me, but I'm 60, so I'm not running. Don't make me run. It's a fascinating read, incredibly well researched. Ultimately, I find this almost reads like an adventure tale where you have good guys, bad guys, and there's a battle to create great films and see them come to life, see these iconic characters come to life on the screen. So if you've ever watched any of the movies, but particularly if you've watched all the movies, I would definitely recommend reading this book.
The Crane Husband by Kelly Barnhill. It's set in the near future in a farming community that has been abandoned in favor of the corporate conglomerate who runs the fields through drones. We follow our protagonist, who is a teen who has been forced to step into a caring role for her younger brother. Her father passed away at the start of the book, and her mother is so focused on her art that she doesn't have any time left over for her children. Our protagonist watches as her mother brings home a new partner, an enormous crane, who will just not leave their house. And while she doesn't know what her mother's doing with this crane, what kind of art they're creating, it seems to be taking up all of her mother's time, to the point that she's neglecting her own health. So as we work through this immense, beautiful tapestry that the mother is working on with her crane, we get hints of the mystery of what's happening, why there's a giant sentient crane on their farm, and what the daughter can do to remove her mother from what's potentially a dangerous situation, as well as caring for herself and her little brother. So there's a lot of family love and difficulty in this novella-length book. One of the main focuses of this book is how being so focused on one thing, obsessed with just that one thing, can really take away from everything else in your life and lead you to neglect even the basics like your health, your safety, and the people you love. So this book was a very fun little jaunt into the dangers of obsession and the love that a family has for one another.
And this year I read The Wager, a story of shipwreck, mutiny, and murder by David Grann. It is narrative nonfiction about the 18th century shipwreck of the ship The Wager off the coast of Patagonia. And it tells a story about what the crew goes through to try and survive. It's an adventure story, and it's part true crime, and it's written more like a novel, so it's really exciting to read, but there's a lot of great history lesson in it as well. And it inspired a lot of maritime literature for centuries afterwards.
The second book is entitled The Last Devil to Die. It was written by Richard Osman. Richard Osman is a British writer. It's part of the Thursday Murder Club series, so this is the fifth one in that series. It's a charming series. It's four main characters. They're set in a retirement village, and obviously they solve crimes. They are amusing. They're charismatic. You will really enjoy that.
Lone Woman by Victor Laval had to be one of the creepiest books I've read recently. The story follows Adeline, who's a 30-year-old African-American woman living in California in the 1915, where she chooses to flee and become a homesteader on her own in Montana. Escaping some type of unseen horror, and basically in a pretty gruesome scene in the beginning, bleak scene in the beginning where she's leaving basically the bodies of her parents, and trying to escape a past. But she's literally dragging her past and a deadly secret from her past behind her in a trunk. This burden, as she says, eventually gets out and ends up killing a guy she brings home, and thus starts a terrifying journey of her trying to suppress her past and the kind of horrors within. Laval is a master at creating a sense of dread and suspense with lines like, "This land is trying to kill every single one of us, let me tell you." Along the way, she meets a murdersome family that seems nice on the front, but really is intent on torturing her. This is really another kind of genre mashup. As much as this is a horror book, it's also a Western. He's really just top form here. It's weird, it's emotional, it's brutal, it's violent, scary, and ultimately an incredibly satisfying read.
End Papers by Jennifer Savrin. This is a very interesting book that deals with a protagonist who isn't really sure who she is and where she fits. I know that sounds a lot like every coming-of-age novel of all time, but we do start in a slightly more mature setting for our protagonist. She's in a long-term relationship, she has a fulfilling career that she genuinely enjoys, but there's something that's missing from who she is and what she wants from the world. So as she's trying to figure out what's wrong in her relationship, what's wrong with who she is and how she is presenting herself to other people, that sort of disconnect, the letter she finds in her most recent project directs her toward a woman that she doesn't even know is still alive. The letter comes from about 40 to 50 years previously and is a love letter from one woman to another woman in her town. And the protagonist becomes increasingly obsessed with figuring out who was the author of this letter. Did she ever truly fall in love with the girl that she wrote it to? Were they able to build a life together? As she becomes more and more invested in the story that she's researching, she finds herself drifting farther away, both from her workplace and from her long-term partner. She also finds herself discovering more about who she is truly, whether it's in terms of how she dresses, how she presents herself, what she wishes to do, the fulfillment that she finds outside of her relationship and inside of it, and where those things are going wrong. So this self-quest is paralleled by her quest for the woman who wrote the letter. And as we go, she discovers what she will do for the truth, whether it means lying to herself, lying to the people around her, making up stories, or just coming clean and saying exactly what she thinks and feels. This is a very melancholy read, but it has such a hope to it that really springs through all of the pages. It left me kind of questioning my own self, my identity, who am I, and adding on to that the sort of hopeful flavor of who I am and what I want. Those things matter and they are achievable. So this was a really encouraging book, even though it does have some sad parts to it. I would definitely recommend checking it out.
The last book is entitled Hercule Poirot's Silent Night. It was written by Sophie Hannah in the style of Agatha Christie. She was authorized by the Agatha Christie estate to write the Hercule Poirot books. This is the fifth one, and in my opinion, this is the best of the five. Obviously, it's a Christmas setting. If you are an avid Agatha Christie reader, you will probably guess who the murderer is, but you may not guess the motive until you get to the end of the book. It's obviously going to be Poirot's explanation of who the killer is and then why they did the killings. But I hope you enjoy them.
That I'd like to recommend is titled Fatherland by Joanna Baxendale Moore. Some of you may know the Baxendale family from Oshkosh. The business was here, way back in the 30s and 40s, and the son, Lee Baxendale, took over the business, I think, in the 50s, and his wife was Joanna Baxendale Moore. So the story is about her. It's called Fatherland, and tells about her growing up in Germany in a small town during the Nazi regime. And it's so interesting because her father, Philipp Steiger, was an architect and a builder, and he also happened to be an avowed communist. Now, the Nazi regime started to arrest him very soon after they took over, and continued to arrest him many times during the life of Joanna as she was growing up in Germany during the Nazi takeover of her small town. And the book is so interesting because it gives details about what it was like to live in the small town as a young girl, going to school, and how the Nazis took over her school and made the teachers that were there just either took them away, or if they were Jewish, of course, they shipped them off to concentration camps. So in her journal that was discovered after her death, and her children and her friends decided to translate it, she gives much of the detail of what it's like to live in an occupied area and how careful they had to be in order to survive, and actually gives so much detail. I thought it wasn't a book that I've ever seen so much detail before, and very well written. After the war was over, she married one of the United States Army lieutenants that was there, and later she got a job with the American Red Cross as a translator. That was before she came to the United States. And then when she did come to the United States, she went to California, where her husband's family was, and eventually she ends up in Wisconsin, gets her PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and is teaching German. And at some point soon after that, in the 1950s and 60s time period, she becomes engaged to Lee Baxendale and moves to Oshkosh. So I think it's really a local history story, but a lot of people will enjoy it because of the Oshkosh connection.